All right, guys, welcome back to the leadership class. Today, we're finally going to be getting into the history of our church, the Church of South India. And I'm excited to get into that with y'all. First, I know we had our last class a couple months ago before the holidays. So just wanted to bring up this chart again on the St. Thomas Christians or Syrian Christians, give you an idea of what we talked about last class. Part of what I was trying to get across to everyone is that our church is not Syrian Christian, but for many of us whose parents or grandparents come from Madhya Kerala or East Kerala, we are connected to the Syrian Christians through blood ties, basically, and that does impact how we practice our faith kind of culturally. So, for example, my mom is Syrian Christian. She's Marthama. My wife was Syrian Christian before she married me. She was Orthodox. And as an example of how that can affect your piety or how it affects how you practice your faith, I would give the example of taking off your shoes before you go into church, or for some people, they take off their shoes before they go up to take communion. That's not a CSI thing. That's not an Anglican or a Congregationalist or a Methodist thing. If you go to a CSI church in Tamil Nadu or in Karnataka, you're not going to see that happen. That's something that, for me, when I first took Holy Communion, my mom told me, hey, take your shoes off before you take Holy Communion. And that's a practice that comes more from the Syrian tradition. So it impacts how you practice your faith. It's not bad if you do that, and it's not wrong if you don't do that. It's just a sort of a question of piety, how you practice your faith. So even though we are not Syrian Christian, it does sort of influence us in different ways, which is interesting. So I want to say again why we're spending so much time on church history. Part of the reason why I'm going so in depth on this in this leadership class before we get into questions of the doctrine of the Bible or the doctrine of the last things like heaven, hell, new creation, that kind of stuff, is because I don't think all of our people really appreciate the miracle of what happened in 1947, how big of a deal it was. I mean, we hear about it from Hutchins or from people sometimes talking about yeah, it was like a new move of the Spirit, it was a miracle, and it just sounds like hyperbole. And I think it's only when you get into the history of the divisions within the church and the depth of those divisions that you start to appreciate how big of an accomplishment it really was to unite these differing factions together, and also to be inspired for the reason why they wanted to come together, which we'll get into in this class. And I also want us to learn the lessons of history, the lessons of 1947, because what you're going to see in this class is the combination of two things that led to the actual formation of our church. One was a very strong theological vision of what the church is and why it should be united, combined with really 50 years of patient, hard, bureaucratic work. I think many of us growing up in our churches, we're used to things like having, hour-long, 2-hour-long meetings where you have to take minutes and someone has to make a motion and a second and all those things. And you're always like, what is the point of all of this? Well, if you have a theological vision, that kind of patient, sometimes frustrating work can really pay off, and it can lead to really great things happening. But you need both. You can't just have a vision and not follow it through with the work, and you can't just have the work without any vision of what the work is moving towards. Also, I want to make clear, what was that vision? And I think the unique thing about our church is that it is really founded on an argument for visible reunion of the church. So if you go to different church traditions, they have different answers to the question isn't it a problem that we are divided? So if you go to Catholics or Orthodox people, their response would be, the church is not divided, we are the church, right? And if you want to be united, you should join us. So a Roman Catholic would say, church is not divided, the church still exists, it is the Roman Catholic Church. You other people are like, you're Christians, and God will have, mercy on you because he's a, merciful God, but you're not part of the true church. If you want to be part of the true church, you have to become Roman Catholic. So that's one way to answer sort of the challenge of division, is to deny that the division really exists. Another way of answering it is, well, we don't have to be visibly united in that. So let me define that. Visibly united means that we are united in faith and in order, right? So in what we believe and in who we are accountable to. Who is accountable to who? That's the question of order. One way to answer that question is to say, we don't have to be visibly united in that way. We can just recognize one another's ministries and share communion, but we don't have to like be accountable to one another in any formal ways. And we don't have to have those hard questions of like, where do we have to agree with one another, and what can we agree to disagree on? We can kind of bypass those questions by just doing something called federation. So that's like the relationship between the Marthoma Church and the CSI Church, right? We share communion, we recognize each other's ministries, but we are not formally accountable to one another. And there's no necessity in like really digging deep in questioning like, what is it we believe? We kind of like respect one another's space to figure that out. And then the final way to answer that question of like division is to say, well, Jesus knows who's a real Christian. All the real Christians are united. So in any different church, there are real Christians and there are fake Christians. All the real Christians are united invisibly by the Holy Spirit. That's all that Jesus is talking about. And so all we need to be united is to partner on local mission. We don't need to be accountable to one another. We don't have to ask those questions about faith and order. We just, volunteer at the soup kitchen together, put on an ecumenical program around Christmas time. That's, that kind of cooperation is enough. That's another way of answering the question of like the division in the churches. Our church is based on sort of a recognition that the kind of unity Jesus talks about in John chapter 17, which is so central to our church's existence, the kind of unity Jesus talks about is a kind of unity that is visible to the world. The world can see it. And that is the kind of unity that prompts the world to believe Jesus's message. So these other answers are not satisfying to the forebears of our church. So getting into the history of like our church's formation, we ended the first class kind of talking about the missionary movement, and I'll kind of touch on that to give you guys an idea of what was going on again. So the missionary movement really sprang up in the late 1700s and then into the 1800s with not just British, but primarily British contact. So the state of play by the time you get into the 1800s is you have the Anglican Church, really organized under the Church Mission Society and the Society for the Propagation of the Gospel. You have Congregationalists. These are the ones who are like, every church is kind of basically independent and figures out its own affairs. In America, they would be the Puritans. That's what we called them here. They were kind of the fathers of the Baptists later on. They were mostly organized under the London Mission Society and the American Board of Commissioners of Foreign Missions. Those were the people sending missionaries to southern India at the time. Then there's the Presbyterians, which it was very diverse. You had some from Scotland, some from the Netherlands, some from Switzerland and Germany, some coming from America and Australia. And then finally you had the Methodist Society, Missionary Society of Britain, sending missionaries as well. So all these different places and theological traditions were sending missionaries to southern India. So the beginning for the idea that all of these different missionaries should come together and cooperate began with William Carey, who was actually a Calvinistic Baptist. And so like a Calvinistic Baptist, if you know who John Piper is in the United States, that's basically like what William Carey was like. And if you know John Piper, he is not someone who is soft on the doctrines of what he believes at all. And so he has reason to be like skeptical of ecumenical or partnering with other churches on different things, because he's very strong on the doctrine of his church. And that's the way William Carey was too. He was very strict on things like doctrine. But once he was sent to the mission field and saw the vastness of the kind of the scale of evangelization that was necessary, that's what kind of prompted him to say, okay, look, you know, I really care about the doctrines that I believe in. I think they're very important, but there's no way we're going to evangelize, you know, 1/5 of humanity in India unless we work together. And so that's when he had the dream to start a college, Serampore College, which is a very important college even today in India. I think it's the oldest college in India. He started it with a few other missionaries, and he had the desire to start a conference of all Christians, like an association of all Christians once every 10 years to focus on evangelization, not just in India, but all around the world. It never happened, but that dream actually 100 years later led to the 1910 Edinburgh Conference, which we'll talk about. So during his lifetime in the early 1800s, it didn't happen, but his desire for that inspired a lot of people 100 years later. And that had a lot of effects on our church as well. So Carey was a Congregationalist. He even though he was very rooted in his Congregationalist beliefs, once he was in the mission field, he saw the practical need for churches working together and uniting in some kind of fashion. And that was the experience of missions in South India and worldwide. The more missionaries were kind of out there doing the work of evangelism, the more they realized that disunity was confusing to non-Christians, because they were like, why are you coming and talking to me about this same Jesus person, but in a different way than the Catholics are, or even than the other Protestants are, your own British people? Like, there seem to be so many different sects. How do I know which one is right? They also saw that there would be a need eventually for the church to be strong. It would need to be nativized, like it would need to have native Indian leadership. And it needs to be truly authentically Indian for it to really take root and to be effective in evangelizing. And if you were going to do that, you couldn't just reproduce European divisions on the Indian population. So that kind of like pressure led to something called missionary comedy. It's basically this idea of cooperation where missionaries from different traditions would say, I'll take this village. So I'm a Methodist missionary, you're a Presbyterian missionary. I'll take this village. You, the Presbyterian missionary, take this next village. And if we create a church out of that and people start moving from different villages, they'll just go to your church. So that there was like some sort of cooperation that was starting to form kind of organically in the 1800s. Another thing that led to the desire for union was growing nationalist sentiment in India. Why should we be under, you know, the British colonizers? We should take, so among the native people, there was a desire for people to take ownership of their own church. On the Anglican side in the 1800s, there was a developing theology for reunion, originally more focused on reuniting with the Catholics and Orthodox, but that didn't work out. So it ended up moving towards more of the Protestants. And then finally, there were practical steps by Congregationalists, especially, moving towards union that created kind of its own momentum for further union. And we'll get into that too. So let me talk a little bit about the Anglican, the growing Anglican desire and theology of union. This, I think, is epitomized in the Chicago Lambeth Quadrilateral, which ended up being the basis, sort of the theological basis on which the union of the churches that became CSI took place. So it was actually a priest in the United States, an Episcopal priest, William Huntington Reed, who wrote an essay on, and he was more focused on uniting the Anglican churches with the Orthodox and Catholic churches. And he was kind of like wondering in this essay, like, what would that union kind of look like? On what basis could it take place? And what he came up with were the Holy Scriptures containing all things necessary to salvation. So if you have a question on salvation, you find it in the Bible. The creeds, especially the Apostles and Nicene creeds, as a sufficient statement of Christian faith. So by saying this, he's saying, you know, like the Roman Catholics develop a lot of different doctrines later on. The Protestant Reformers develop a lot of different statements later on. That stuff is cool. We can look at that and see what's good in it. But for the basis of union, for the basis of being united in faith and in order, all that is necessary is agreement on the creeds. Commitment to the dominical sacraments of baptism and Holy Communion, and then the historic episcopate, locally adapted. So the idea of rule by bishops. So those were the four things he sort of proposed as being the basis for reunion of all the churches, but in his mind, more focused on the Catholic and Orthodox churches. Makes sense because they have bishops, right? And that essay kind of like became very popular in the Episcopal Church. In 1886, the House of Bishops of the Episcopal Church formally endorsed it. Eventually, it went to the Lambeth Conference. The Lambeth Conference is basically all the Anglican bishops worldwide meeting together. And the Lambeth Conference also endorsed this statement, originally in Chicago, as like a statement for this is how reunion with the other churches can take place. But that original idea of uniting with the Roman Catholics and the Orthodox didn't go anywhere. Instead, increasingly, the Anglican missionaries realized like the potential for reunion lies more with their Protestant brothers and sisters, even though they don't have bishops, which caused problems that we'll get into. So by 1930, the different missions, Anglican missions across India had been organized into the Church of India, Burma, and Ceylon. And you have to remember, India back then didn't just refer to what is now the nation of India. It also referred to Pakistan and Bangladesh. So if you look today, the Church of India, Burma, and Ceylon doesn't exist. What happened to it? It ended up becoming the Church of South India, the Church of North India, the Church of Pakistan, and the Church of Bangladesh. And interestingly, all four of these churches are what's considered united churches, churches that aren't just Anglican. They united with other Protestant denominations as well. So in addition to the Anglican missions now organized under a church, the Church of India, Burma, and Ceylon, there's also the South Indian district of the Methodist Church that's happening. They had some churches in Kerala, but they were mostly focused in the other three major states, with the Telugu people, the Kannada speaking people in the Tamil areas. And then you had the Presbyterian missions, again, coming from different parts of the world. These are not the only Presbyterian missions in South India, but four of the most prominent were the Free Church of Scotland, the American Arcot Mission, the Church of Scotland, and the Basil Mission. The American Arcot Mission is like a very famous medical mission. If you've ever heard of the Scudder family in the United States, they're part of the Reformed Church in America. They were the ones that started the Arcot Mission in Tamil Nadu. And the Basil Mission is a mission of German Calvinists and Lutherans who started a mission in southern India as well, and they ended up being part of our church. So in 1890, Presbyterian missionaries in Madras read a report that there's a church in China where Dutch Reformed missionaries and English Presbyterian missionaries had united to form one church. And that kind of is what kicks off people thinking, you know, we have a lot of like Dutch missionaries, Scottish missionaries, American missionaries, German and Lutheran missionaries, but we're all like broadly Reformed, mostly Calvinistic. We agree on a lot of doctrine. Mostly our missions are separated because they come from different countries. Maybe just like what happened in China, we can all come together to form a united church. So they kind of inspired by that, and also inspired by something that had been happening in Japan, these missionaries united to form the South India United Church in 1901. So on the Presbyterian side, that's what kind of motivated them to join with each other and also with the Congregationalists later on to form the South India United Church. Meanwhile, so 1901, South India United Church formed, right? Congregationalists around the same time saw, so the Congregationalists are very doctrinally similar to the Presbyterians. They're also very Reformed. Their main difference is that the Congregationalists believe every church is basically independent, decides its own affairs. The Presbyterians believe that every church is accountable to a council of churches above it. So you have a local church ruled by a committee, a session, and that session is accountable to a presbytery, which is a council of all the, of representatives from all the different churches, and that presbytery is accountable to an assembly. The Congregationalists don't believe in that. They believe that every church kind of does its own thing. But in terms of doctrine, they're very, very similar. The Congregationalists see what is going on with the Presbyterians, and they are inspired to start uniting with one another as well. There had already been a desire. I talked about this, like starting with William Carey among the Congregationalists, seeing the need to evangelize, to start like formalizing their ties to one another. But once they saw the Presbyterians actually do it, they started taking steps to do it. So they formed the General Union of United Churches of South India with a membership of 133,000. So after those two bodies formed, they sort of looked at each other and were like, well, we're not so different. Maybe we can come together too. And so those conversations actually started in 1902, very quickly after the bodies were first formed. So one of the interesting things is, like, if you were a Presbyterian, you might be a little hesitant to join with the Congregationalists, because the new church would be like 90% Congregationalist. Only 10% of the people in the new church that they formed, the South India United Church, would be Presbyterian. And if you're a Congregationalist, you might be kind of hesitant to join with the Presbyterians, because even though the Presbyterians were 10% of the new church, they were making a lot of demands that kind of go against Congregationalist principles for how churches should be governed. They wanted to have their system of councils, sort of governing the churches. And that would be the Congregationalist churches giving up a lot of their independence. And, they're 90% of the new church, so why would they agree to that? But the churches did agree to form by 1908, and they formed the South India United Church. And I think the statement of the president, J.P. Cottingham, sort of shows why they united, even though they might have had reasons not to do that. They wanted to bind the church together into one body with a view of developing a self-supporting, self-governing, and self-propagating Indian church, which shall present a united living testimony to Christ and worthily represent to the world the Christian idea. And so it was this very idealistic statement, again, rooted in what we were talking about earlier. It was for the purpose of evangelization. They believed that they needed to be united, no matter what the sacrifices were for their different bodies, in order to present to the world, and especially to India, a vision of unity that would be compelling enough that people would start to be interested in Christianity. The new church basically blended Presbyterianism and Congregationalism. There was more independence for the local church than would be typical in a Presbyterian church, but there was definitely a lot more accountability than would be typical by a Congregational church. And, it was basically a blend between the two different styles. Something that was happening around the same time, William Carey's dream of a kind of a conference, a world conference of all the churches talking about missionaries. It came to fruition in 1910 in the Edinburgh Conference. This was really a student-led phenomenon. One of the interesting things about the 1800s, 19th century missionary movement was that it was really led by college students who got very passionate about the gospel and ended up dedicating their lives to becoming missionaries after they graduated from college. And so it was kind of a natural thing that this conference grew out of a student federation that was meeting in 1895. And again, this shows the commitment of those missionaries to the idea of unity and evangelism going hand in hand. And the theme of the conference was actually John 17:21. Again, showing a commitment to the idea that visible reunion is necessary for like real powerful evangelism. So by 1909, 1910, you have the South India United Church. You have the Church of India in Burma and Ceylon, which is not part of these conversations about union yet, but which has developed a theology of union through the reunion through the Chicagoland Beth Quadrilateral. And then you have the Methodists. And by this time, there were certain SIUC leaders who were interested in pursuing union with the Methodists. But Calvinists and Methodists have very different ideas on theology. So they didn't think that real like reunion, visible reunion on faith and order was possible. So instead they thought, let's just do a federation, kind of what Martha and CSI has right now, right? Like we're not going to require that we be accountable to one another or formally joined together, but we will form this federation where we recognize one another's ministries. And this was seen as like the next step of missionary comedy, where we sort of like kind of have a gentleman's agreement. You take this district, I take that district, that kind of thing. You take this village, I take that village. And I think the missionaries reflecting on that period of the Federation realized that it didn't go far enough, that it didn't really work because they weren't actually addressing the fundamental questions of faith and order, what we believe and who we are accountable to. And so that federation, it was a significant step in cooperation between the Congregationalists and the Presbyterians. Now we can just call them the Reformed Church on one side and the Methodists. It was a significant step forward, but I think everyone quickly realized that it wasn't very successful. It was kind of a failure. Simultaneously, around the same time, in 1899, an Anglo-Catholic was appointed Bishop of Madras. And the reason why I specify he's an Anglo-Catholic is Anglicans themselves are kind of like CSI today, not very united in questions of theology or practice or things like that. There's a lot of diversity within the church. There are people who are more evangelical, and then there are people who are more Catholic in the sense of being very inspired by the Roman Catholics and by the Orthodox churches. And so the people during the 1800s, Anglo-Catholicism was a movement within the Anglican Church to kind of bring to unite more with the Roman Catholics and the Orthodox, and to bring in a lot of those older traditions into the Church of England. And they had some success in doing that. And so the reason why I specify that Henry Whitehead is an Anglo-Catholic is that he would not be a person who would theologically be inclined in uniting with more Protestant people. He would be more interested in uniting with like Catholics or Orthodox. But once he came to India, he saw that even though his church was having a big impact in like building colleges and hospitals and those kinds of things, there had been no conversions. There were no conversions in the Oxford mission to Calcutta which managed a college for 25 years. He was very disappointed by that. And he saw that there was a huge potential for evangelism, but he didn't think that his church in Madras had the infrastructure to reach all of those people and really send the message of the gospel. But he's looking over at the Reformed Church, which is very strong in Tamil Nadu, and he was like, man, they actually have the infrastructure to do that. How can we come together and really work together? And interestingly, he was not supportive of federal union, where you just recognize one another's ministries and cooperate. He was very inspired by the Chicago Lambeth Quadrilateral, and he believed that if we were going to work together, we should become one united church. And so he gave a speech to that effect in 1912, and that speech was very persuasive to other Anglican bishops, including V.S. Azariah, who was the first Indian Anglican bishop, and E.J. Palmer in Bombay. So this is kind of when the Anglicans start to get involved, after Whitehead gives that speech in 1912. So Azariah, who had been influenced by that speech, he attends in April 1919, he attends an interdenominational, like, Hutchins conference, right, like ministers conference, and the theme there was evangelism. And so while he's at this conference with missionaries or priests, bishops, not bishops, but priests from other traditions, they start talking with one another, and they come up with this idea of holding another conference specifically on the question of union. So again, this tight linkage between unity and evangelism, right? They're at a conference about evangelism, they're talking about evangelism, and they're inspired to have a conference to consider the question of unity. And so they decide to meet at Trankbar, which is a Danish colony on the southeast coast of India. And so 33 delegates attended the conference. 31 of them were native Indians, and they come from the SIUC, the Anglican Church, the Methodists, and then the Church of Sweden, which are Lutherans, also attended. Again, the theme for the conference was John 17:21. And something I've heard that the Marthoma people were involved in these discussions, but I don't know if they were at Trankbar. If any of you ever find out, please let me know, because I could not find in anything written at what point were the Marthoma people involved and at what point did they kind of step back. At this point, the Lutherans were involved. They were invited to the meeting. But what happened was they eventually decided to step back. So as convener of the conference, Azariah sent out questions in advance to the people who were attending. What do you think to be the distinctive features of your church, basically? Should a united Indian church come into being? What do you think your church could contribute to a united church? And what do you think, your tradition could never give up if they were to join a united church? What are like sort of the non-negotiables? What are the red lines in coming together? And then finally, what is the attitude of your church towards union with other churches? So those are the questions he sent out. It was pretty clear early on that the Church of Sweden, the Lutherans, could not join. They basically wanted the new church to be a Lutheran church. And so after Trankbar, they stopped participating in the questions of union. But the Reformed churches, the SIUC and the Anglicans, saw potential for union, and they wrote the Trankbar Manifesto in 1920. The Methodists did not initially sign the manifesto in 1920, but they stayed involved in the meetings, and they eventually signed the manifesto in 1925. So what was the Trankbar Manifesto? It was basically a plan towards union based on the Chicago Lambeth Quadrilateral, and a pledge of the people, those of the 33 people who attended. It was a pledge of those who agreed with the manifesto to work towards union. And I do want to read that statement because I think it's very indicative of the spirit behind the negotiations. We believe that the union is the will of God, even as our Lord prayed that we might be one, that the world might believe. So that's a reference to John 17:21. We believe that the challenge of the present hour in the period of reconstruction after the war, referring to World War II, in the gathering together of the nations and the present critical situation in India calls us to mourn our past divisions and turn to our Lord Jesus Christ to seek in him the unity of the body expressed in one visible church. We face together the titanic task of the winning of India for Christ, 1/5 of the human race. Yet, confronted by such an overwhelming responsibility, we find ourselves rendered weak and relatively impotent by our unhappy divisions, divisions for which we were not responsible and which have been, as it were, imposed upon us from without, divisions which we did not create and which we do not desire to perpetuate. Now remember, these are mostly Native Indians writing this statement too. So that's why they're saying these divisions were imposed from without. And these are Native Indians who are recognizing, as the missionaries before them recognized, the huge scale of the challenge of evangelizing India, 1/5 of the human race. And even today, I think the population of India is like 18%, close to 1/5 of the human population. So this manifesto kicked off 21 years of joint committee negotiations. And basically, during those 21 years, everyone kind of knew what the red lines were. They just didn't take the leap to make a final decision. So the Anglican terms were, okay, if we're going to come together, we need to have bishops, basically. You need to accept the fact of the episcopacy. You don't have to agree to any theory to the episcopacy. There were a lot of Anglo-Catholics at the time, inspired by the Roman Catholics and the Orthodox, who had like very sophisticated theological takes on why the episcopacy was necessary. The Anglicans were like, okay, we know you Reformed people and Methodists, you may not buy any of those sophisticated theologies for why bishops are nice and necessary. But we do want you to accept the historical fact of the episcopacy, and we want you to acknowledge that bishops would be good for the new church to have as a symbol of unity. The SIUC, the Reformed Church, their terms were basically, okay, we might be willing to do that, but we need you, Anglicans, to recognize the spiritual equality of our ministers. And that was a big ask from the Anglican perspective, because they were coming from the more Catholic Orthodox influence perspective that unless you have bishops, you're not a real church, and your ministers are not real ministers because they've not been appointed according to apostolic succession. So that was kind of, at the end of the day, those were the dividing lines for 21 years. Can you accept bishops, and can the non-Anglicans accept bishops, and can the Anglicans accept the quality of the other ministers? So at the 1920 Lambeth Conference, they learned that the churches in India were discussing doing this, and they were actually pretty excited about the idea, but they suggested that, okay, you guys can unite, but the Anglicans have to sort of reordain the non-Anglicans, which was, not acceptable to the non-Anglican ministers. They're saying, if we agree to be reordained by you, then we are basically saying that our prior ministries were not valid, and they were not willing to do that. So that was a big question. Are we going to do supplemental ordination, reordination, basically? Another sort of sticking point was, what comes first? Do we agree to unite on different theological questions and differences that we might have first? Or do we kind of like take a leap of faith, unite first, even though we don't agree on everything? We agree on the Nicene Creed, we agree on the Apostles' Creed. If we can agree on bishops, if we can agree on sacraments, all the different things of the Lambeth Quadrilateral, is that enough? Can we just take that leap and then hope that afterwards we kind of figure out ways to compromise with one another and to live together even if we have differences? or do we figure out all those other things first and then unite? And so the idea, the plan, the scheme, which it was called, was let's do it as we unite first, and then we'll figure out all these other secondary questions later after we've united, which is kind of a gamble and a risk, right? And then there was another proposal by the Methodists, which was really more to address, again, an Anglican problem. So related to this idea that the non-Anglican ministers are not real ministers, there was a question of whether Anglican congregations would accept non-Anglican ministers to do their services, especially for Holy Communion. And so the Methodists proposed, hey, let's respect the consciences of individual congregations with respect to what ministers they get. And at first everyone was like, yeah, okay, we'll do that. But then they started thinking more like, what does that really mean? Is this going to mean that for like 20, 30 years, no person from a Methodist background can be an utchin or a priest for an Anglican congregation? Doesn't that defeat the purpose of like melding everyone together, becoming one church? So at first the pledge was like greeted enthusiastically, but then when people started thinking, what does that really mean? It led to a lot of problems. So those were the kind of the main questions they were debating for 21 years. By 1941, you can kind of like, so V.S. Azariah, for example, the guy I was talking about in 1919, the bishop, the first native Indian bishop of the Anglican Church, he's involved during this entire time. And by 1941, you can sense like the people who have been involved for 21 years, they're getting exhausted because they're very enthusiastic about union, but every time they take it back to their home churches for a decision, the home churches won't make a decision. They kind of like delay it. So they make this declaration in 1941. We have to make a final decision. We give thanks to God for the many signs that our churches are nearer to union than they ever have been, but the time has come to decide whether we can come together on the basis of this scheme. We can't keep amending it or trying to criticize it or find different plans for union. Basically what had been happening is everything had been happening in a loop. You know, we come to some sort of consensus on the question of respecting individual consciences of congregations in terms of like what priests can be sent where. We come to some sort of consensus on ordination. We don't want to do supplemental ordination, but then the Anglicans will come and be like, well, but can we find a way to do supplemental ordination? You know, and so it just kept on going in this loop. So the Joint Committee finally says, okay, we need to make a final decision. This is either happening in 3 years, in 1944, or it's not happening, and we should drop it. Around the same time in 1943, many leaders, so by 1943, many of the old leaders of the Joint Committee had passed away or were very, very old, so they had retired, including Azariah. He had died by this point. So new leaders were coming in. This kind of ultimatum had been sent in 2 years earlier by the Joint Committee. It didn't really seem like the home churches were going to do anything with it. So it seemed like everything was kind of going to close up shop and the Joint Committee would disband and the churches would not unite. But then new leaders came in, younger leaders in 1943. And what's interesting is that at first, not all of them agreed with union, but they were appointed by their churches to be part of this Joint Committee. And once they started talking to one another, they became very excited for union. So on the Anglican side, it was Bishop Michael Hollis, who ends up becoming the first moderator of the CSI. On the SIUC side, it was Leslie Newbegin who was appointed to the committee. He later becomes the first deputy moderator of the CSI. On the Methodist side, it was A.M. Ward, and then they appointed, I think, a Methodist secretary of the committee, J.S.M. Hooper. And again, at first, these people were, the new leaders of the committee did not even know if they agreed whether the committee should exist. But once they started talking to one another, they realized, they became excited by the great potential for unity. As an example, Leslie Newbegin didn't agree with the idea of requiring all the churches to have bishops, which is ironic because he ended up becoming a bishop.
but coming from a Reformed background, bishops is not a thing. And so he was like, I don't know if I can affirm episcopacy, the idea of rule by bishops. But after he read Michael Ramsey's The Gospel in the Catholic Church, which is a very important Anglican book, to try and understand better the argument for episcopacy, he became convinced that having bishops would actually be a good thing. And so the same thing happened, similar things happened on the Anglican or Methodist side. Once they started learning more about the other traditions, they became excited for the good things that the other traditions could bring to them and to their churches. They started realizing the value of the other traditions. So that led to a new energy for coming together. And the first sign of that is in 1944, really due to like the energetic leadership of Hollis. The Church of India, Burma, and Ceylon voted to allow the 4 dioceses of South India to join the new church. And part of that was recognizing that bishops are, this is an old statement from an Anglican reformer named Richard Hooker. Bishops are of the bene esse of the church, but not the esse. What that means is bishops are good for the church, but they are not necessary to the essence of the church. You can be, so they were kind of recognizing, and Hooker recognized this as an old Anglican reformer in the 1600s. Bishops are a great way to organize a church, but they don't have to be the only way to organize a church. And so that kind of humility was reflected in the churches allowing the 4 dioceses of Southern India to join the union, because that gave them the space to recognize the ministries of the other churches as valid ministries, as not as fake ones, but as valid ones. And that's basically what the statement shows. Part of what the statement, when they allowed the Anglican churches to join what became the CSI, is they also made a statement saying, look, we want to respect the consciences of the congregations, but it is not a valid reason to say that a presbyter comes from another tradition in the United Church. You can't object to having an utchin if that utchin comes from a Methodist background or a Reformed background. That's not a good enough reason to object to the utchin. So that was like a big deal for the Anglican Church to have the grace to say that, because that kind of signaled to the Reformed and the Methodist people that their ministries were going to be respected. They also agreed not to do supplemental ordination, which is also a big deal. The Church of North India, which was formed in 1970, that did require supplemental ordination. The fact that the Anglican churches in CSI did not require supplemental ordination led to problems with the Anglican Communion for about like 25 years. The Anglican Communion did not fully accept our church for about 25 years because we allowed people from non-Episcopal ministries to exercise ministry within our church. So finally, all the churches by 1945, basically 1946, they all agreed to unite. The ceremony for union was September 27th, 1947. On that date, 2,500 people gathered for the inaugural ceremony of the CSI. Bishop C.K. Jacob of Madhya Kerala presided over the ceremony. It was a very emotional ceremony. Everyone was crying. From what I was reading, everyone was crying. It's not like I was there. And they left signed copies of the scheme of union on the altar table. And there was part of the reason why I was so emotional is because people love their church, right? Like they love the old churches that they're a part of. And so when you're joining together with this new church, in a sense, the old church that you loved is dying. And you have to be willing to sacrifice that to allow something new to be birthed. So that's part of the reason why I was very emotional. This is a statement from New Begin on like the change that was wrought by the churches united. Like what difference did it make, right? Like that's maybe a fair question to ask. What difference did it really make that all these churches united? So by the time he was retiring in the 1970s, he made this statement. My impression of the churches in Madras as I knew them before 1947, was that they were separate congregations, each concerned about their own affairs. I do not remember getting any impression of a coherent body of people concerned about the city as a whole. It was not the church for others. I do not want to draw a romanticized picture of things as they are now, but I am bound to say that the feel is different. I have found people willing to think about the needs of the city as a whole. I've seen the churches deeply and effectively involved, along with government and other agencies, in meeting the problems of the slums, of the beggars with leprosy, of the preschool children who have nowhere to go when their parents are at work, of the old and of the despairing. Of course, there's still much congregational introversion. There's still plenty of churches where, as an elder of one of them said to me the other day, it is felt to be enough if the church caters for the needs of its members. But no one could live through the experience that I have had from 1936 to 1947 and from 1965 to last year without being conscious of the difference. So there's this idea that because of union, the church is now more able to look outside of itself and really be a church for the sake of the city around it, because the church is more united within itself. And now is no longer as concerned with just catering to the needs of its members, its internal members. We already talked about the theological basis for union. I know I've taken a lot of time, I'm sorry. I do have a couple more slides to get through though, so bear with me. If you need to hop off, I understand if you need to hop off, but I do have a couple more slides left. So the theological basis for union, faith and order. Again, doctrinally, it was the Nicene Creed and the Apostles' Creed, but there were questions about order, like ordination and episcopacy. We talked about that already. There's also a deeper question underneath that on what is the church, right? So there's the more Anglo-Catholic answer. The church is that community that has continuity with the community that Jesus himself established. And so that's the reason why to Anglo-Catholics, the idea of apostolic succession is very important, because apostolic succession is a way of ensuring that that continuity historically is maintained. You have bishops ordaining bishops, going back all the way to the apostles. That's the claim anyway. Then there's the more Protestant answer. The church is where you find the right preaching of the word and right administration of the sacrament. So from the Reformed or Methodist perspective, it doesn't matter as much like whether you have a bishop ordaining a bishop that you can trace all the way back to the apostles. What matters more is that the Bible is taught rightly and the sacraments are administered rightly. And if you're not doing that properly, then you don't have a real church. And then by the time the CSI is formed, there was also the rise of the Pentecostal movement, where it's like none of those questions really matter. What really matters is the presence of the Holy Spirit. If the Holy Spirit is present, then you have a real church. So all these ideas are kind of like flowing around in southern India on what is the church exactly? To answer the question, what is the church exactly? And the CSI ends up basically endorsing all three, right? Like they're saying, look, all three of these matter. We're not going to pit them against one another. I would say probably the second one has like kind of a preeminence in our church, but the other two are important as well, and we're not going to neglect them. The other questions are, how do we understand the division of the church? And part of the theological move of the church, of the CSI in coming together, is recognizing that justification by faith applies not just to individuals, but also to communities. So justification by faith is this idea that I am a sinner and I am also saved by grace at the same time. I'm simultaneously a sinner and a saint, right? And so we can apply that insight to the community of the church as well. It's not just true of me as a believer, it's also true of the church. The church is we can acknowledge that the church has sinned, right? Like that was kind of a new idea for especially some Anglo-Catholics who wanted to believe that the church is can never make a mistake, and so therefore had a lot of problems acknowledging prior mistakes or that kind of thing. So we can acknowledge that the church itself can make mistakes, and yet it is also saved by grace. And then finally, there is this insight that unity is a means to the gospel. A united church helps in evangelizing and spreading the message of the gospel everywhere. But unity is also the fruit of the gospel. If you really believe in the gospel, it's going to push you towards uniting with others who believe that gospel. So unity as the fruit and means of the gospel. That was another theological takeaway from the 50 years of conversation that led towards union. I think all of that is emphasized in the way the church understood itself. So this is by R.D. Paul. I think he's a layman. I don't think he's a priest. He wrote a book called The First Decade, which is reflecting on the first 10 years of the Church of South India. And so this is kind of what he said about the church. The Church of South India does not imagine itself to be a church which has been brought into existence in order that it may be one more church among the various churches in the world. The CSI, on the other hand, conceives of itself as being the means of bringing together other churches, and that when the moment comes when other churches would also unite, it will dissolve itself in its present form, lose its present identity, and will agree to take its place in a bigger and larger united church which would carry out God's will in the world. It is willing to give up its identity and its constitution, if by so doing it can bring into being something even more in accordance with Christ's will for his churches in the world. And so what that statement is trying to capture is this idea that the CSI does not, or at least initially, I hope it still agrees with this, but does not see itself as just another denomination. It sees itself as a means to God's mission, and as part of that mission in the world, there is this idea that the CSI as a institution must be willing itself to die, right? Like must be willing itself to see, in the same way that the prior churches had to be willing to sacrifice their prior lives in order to give birth to the CSI has to be willing to sacrifice its life in order to give birth to an even more united church. And so that was something that was very central to the church's self-understanding, especially in its early years. And there were a lot of hopes for further union, either with the Church of North India or with the Lutherans eventually, or with the Marthoma Church or whatever. None of them have really led to fruition. It's led to like more federation type things, like recognizing other people's ministries and that kind of thing. But it hasn't led to more union. But I would say that this idea is still alive, because I remember our previous moderator, Thomas Gilman, made a similar statement at one of our conferences, and actually at one of our council meetings, which I don't know if everyone understood exactly what he was saying, but he was saying, our church should be willing to die, and I pray that it will, right? Like, our church should not exist just to continue its own existence. It exists for the sake of God's mission. And that means that we should be uniting with other churches. I want to talk a little bit about the governance of the church. I'm not going to read this statement, but basically central to the idea of how our church is governed is that it wanted to blend all the different ways that the different traditions govern their churches. So there's a congregational element, an idea that every church has a certain degree of autonomy in organizing its own affairs. There's the Presbyterian element, which is the idea of rule by councils and not just by one person. And then there's the Episcopal element. And that's the idea that there is a bishop who is a symbol of unity and who has a certain degree of authority conferred upon him or her. And so those different elements were all blended in the governance of our church. And I'll talk about that a little bit more now here. So at the local level, the congregationalist sort of element is most seen in the fact that we have very strong general bodies, right? And that those general bodies elect a lay committee that works in partnership with the Achin in governing or administering the matters of the church. So I'm not going to say more about that. I'm sure many of you are very familiar with church committees and that kind of thing. There's also something called a district level. That's not like really a formal as formal a level, but it's more in the realms of like cooperating on Sunday school or cooperating on mission or cooperating on just different areas for churches in the same geographical region. In North America, we don't have districts, but we do have regions, region 1, region 2, region 3. So those are more just, and they're organized under a chairperson who's an Uchin, who kind of coordinates the activities of that region. They're more just for cooperation. They're not necessarily governance. The next step up from the local church on governance is the diocese. So at the diocesan level, you have, in the same way a general body elects a committee to govern the church, the general body will also elect representatives to go to the diocesan council, and they partner with all of the Uchins of the diocese in governing the church, led by the bishop of the diocese. So that diocesan council elects an executive committee that sees to sort of the day-to-day operations of the diocese. So at the diocesan executive committee level, there's a clergy secretary, lay secretary, different official positions. So part of the way you might think of this is like your local church has a general body, right? And they elect a committee to govern the church. The general body also sends delegates to the diocesan council, which is itself kind of like a new general body. That diocesan council elects a committee to govern the diocese under the leadership of the bishop. And that diocesan council then also sends representatives to the synod. So the synod is all the dioceses coming together in our church. So from the diocesan level, you select representatives to the synod, and then all those representatives plus the bishops of all of the dioceses come together to form the synod. Let me talk a little bit more about the synod, because many of you may not be as familiar with the synod. When you think about India, you think about your diocese. You don't necessarily think about the synod, which is the highest level of governance in our church. The synod only meets once every 3 years. The last meeting was in January 2020. To give you an idea of how many people attend the synod, actual representatives, it's like around 350 people who participate in the synod. People who are actually elected from the 25 different dioceses. But the attendance is close to 1,000, because you have all the different members of the bureaucracy, the different CSI affiliated bodies, resource people attending to help the synod conduct its business. So again, the synod is the bishop of every diocese plus elected representatives from every diocesan council, with membership determined according to the size of the diocese. And there's a certain amount of representation that is reserved for people under the age of 35. And there's a certain amount of representation reserved for women as well. That synod, which meets once every 3 years, elects a synod executive committee, and it also elects officials for that committee, the moderator, the deputy moderator, which are elected from bishops, and then the general secretary and treasurer, which is elected from presbyters or from Uchins or from lay people. So the synod executive committee, whereas the synod meets once every 3 years, the synod executive committee meets twice a year, and it's about 100 people. They're either elected directly from the synod or they're appointed by the moderator. So since they only meet twice a year, the actual day-to-day governing of the synod of the Church of South India is the synod working committee. So the executive committee of 100 people itself elects a working committee of about 29 people, one representative from each diocese plus the 4 synod officials, the moderator, the deputy moderator, the general secretary, and the treasurer. And that working committee meets as needed, as often as it wants. But any decisions of the working committee can be rescinded or ratified by the executive committee. So it's not like, in our church, it's not like the moderator is like the metropolitan of the Marthoma Church or like the Pope of the Roman Catholic Church. He can't just do whatever he wants, right? He's working in all these different committees. That's the Presbyterian element sort of showing itself. It's a council-led church at the end of the day. The moderator is the first among equals. There's a certain degree of respect and authority that is given to him, especially on the spiritual side, but he can't just make decisions on his own. And that's true also of the bishops of our churches. The bishops have a certain amount of respect and spiritual authority that's given to them, but they can't just make decisions on their own. They make decisions in partnership with the diocesan council. Even ordaining new uchens, a bishop cannot do that on their own authority. They need to be sort of expressly authorized by the diocesan council to ordain new uchens. So we're nearing the end of our time. Last class, I kind of ended with some hard questions for Syrian Christians. I think in the spirit of fair play, there are also hard questions for our church. I've listed out here a lot of the different challenges the church has faced since 1947. I won't necessarily go into all of them, but I do want to highlight what I think is maybe the hardest question that the church has to face, which is when you go back to the animating documents, animating ideas of the people who formed our church, you know, for about, when you look at what they were writing, what they were saying for about 50 years, they were like, let's unite for the purpose of evangelizing India. So I think it's a fair question to ask, like 70 years later, like, how's that going, right? Like, how effective are we being in evangelizing India? And, you know, there's like a lot of good that has happened over the last 70 years. I wouldn't say evangelism is not happening, but I will say, as someone who has become more involved with the church in the last 7 years, I would say that the church at its highest levels has a bit of a diffidence, or like a lack of commitment to the idea of evangelism. Excuse me. And part of the reason why is that many of the leaders of our church have become very influenced by theological modernism, which, to be fair, affected the missionary churches that sent us to during the 20th century. Theological modernism is a certain way of studying the Bible according to historical critical methods. So studying the Bible as a historical question, like what were the sources that went behind the Bible? Who wrote the Bible? What were the different versions of the Bible in like different time periods and stuff like that? What that has led to, especially in Germany, England, and the United States, 3 countries which were very influential theologically for our church. What that has led to is this idea of kind of the Bible as an interesting book of scholarship, but not as the Word of God. And so there's less of a commitment to like some of the larger claims of the Bible, such as that Jesus Christ is the Son of God, or that the only way to God is through Christ, or just different things like that. And I would say that in the interest of ecumenism and in the interest of like being part of India, like a healthy part of India that respects other religions, there are voices in our church that have sort of questioned the need for evangelism, right? Like, why do we need to impose our faith on other people? So there's been a de-emphasis on evangelism in some high circles in our church since the 1970s. And instead, they see the church as a vehicle mostly for justice, right? Like, how do we stand up for the poor or for different minorities? How do we bring them education? That kind of thing. And so there's instead of seeing those things, justice and evangelism as 2 things that go hand in hand, they are seen as things that are oppositional, or that, you know, it's either one or the other. And so I think there's been like less confidence in the idea of evangelism or in the necessity of evangelism. There's been more, less of an emphasis on evangelization. I think that's fair to say. I think also related to that are the problems of just really governing a very diverse, very big church, a church of about 5 million people who don't even speak all the same language, and who are ethnically very diverse as well. As that has happened, and as like globalization has increased, and even within India, you know, Malayalis are moving to Tamil Nadu, and Karnataka, you know, the Kannada people are moving to Telangana, and so like people are not staying in their lanes anymore, right? Like you can't just assume that a Madhya Kerala person is going to stay in Madhya Kerala. They're going to move around India and around the world. But even though that is happening, they still want to go to a Madhya Kerala church, right? Or they still want to go to a Kannada church, or they still, and to an extent you can understand that because there are questions of language and like worshiping in your own language, which is totally fair. But to an extent, that also leads to this idea of like questioning how united really are we, right? Like if we're saying we're uniting for the sake of evangelism, and that by seeing our unity, India specifically will be prompted to realize the truth about the gospel, how united are we when we don't actually worship together and we're still maintaining those kind of ethnic silos? So that's another, I think, challenge. And I also think one of the blessings of our church is that we inherited a lot of great institutions from the missionaries, but that also meant that our church was vulnerable to capture, to people who were not motivated for the ministry for the sake of like evangelism or unity or all those like higher theological ideas, but were motivated for the sake of power, because there is a certain amount of power to be exercised in our church as a result of the legacy of the missionaries. And so that has led to a certain degree of corruption, unfortunately, in the church as well, because with certain posts within the church, you get a certain degree of power of like who gets to attend this college, who gets to attend this, be treated by this hospital, that kind of thing. So I think those are all challenges that are facing our church. Very briefly, I'm just going to talk about the CSI in North America. I think there's a question for us too, in that the whole idea behind the Church of South India is let's unite and be a church for South India for the sake of evangelizing Southern India. So is it a contradiction in terms to even say there's a CSI in North America, like a Church of South India in North America? I think the early part of the reason why the Synod has been reluctant to really organize us as a diocese is because of that question, right? They're like, why should there's a lot of skepticism that there even should be a CSI in North America. That that's a skepticism that didn't exist among the Orthodox, Malayalis or Marthama people who moved over here. They just, organized dioceses very quickly. Whereas for us, there's kind of like a theological question that we have to wrestle with, like, should we even exist, right? The churches kind of formed organically in the 1970s, 1980s without any, it wasn't like the bishops in India were organizing us, right? We're sending missionaries or anything like that. It was more 20-year-old and 30-year-old, uncles and aunties in the 70s finding one another, starting prayer meetings, and eventually finding someone who had a theological degree or who had been ordained, and getting that person ordained by a bishop when he was visiting. They would invite a bishop to come and ordain them, and then you would start a church. And that led to a lot of pain and chaos because then you had Utchins who lived here permanently, and then people would have problems with that Utchins. They would split, they would come back together, yada, yada. We've talked about this before, but there was no real organization among the churches. And there was no real larger vision other than we want to worship according to CSI tradition. We want to worship in Malayalam, right? In 1992, the beginnings of some kind of vision for the churches began to be formed with the formation of the CSI Council in North America, which really grew out of the family conference that started meeting in the 1980s. And the ambition for the council was to eventually form a diocese. And they started making some headway in the 90s, but then in the 2000s, there was a split within the council churches. And basically, kind of the reason why I went into such detail, talking about some of the distinctives of the Madhya Kerala Church, it is tied more to the Syrian Christians through blood, even if not theologically. And the Madhya Kerala Church is also, diocese is also, whereas the other churches are blends of the 4 different churches, the Madhya Kerala diocese is almost 100% Anglican, right? So theologically, it didn't have to compromise as much with the other traditions as the other dioceses did. And so the Council USCMC split occurred when there was a new Madhya Kerala bishop who had problems with the synod, basically. And so he withdrew from all synod activities for a time. And so as part of that, he directed his uchins in the Gulf, in Australia, and also in the United States and Canada to start participating in council stuff, because council was a union of Madhya Kerala churches with other churches as well, right? Like churches from other dioceses. And so when that happened, that led to basically like a huge rupture within the CSI community here in the United States for about 10 years. And that led to a big exodus among Maya Chachans and Chechis, people who now might be in their 40s, who were kind of similar to us. They didn't have the internet, but they were by the 2000s, they were getting very passionate about the church. They had a lot of ideas about what the church should be doing. They were starting to step up into positions of leadership. But then when the split happened, they were kind of torn apart on different sides as well by their parents. And they also didn't understand like why this was happening. And so a lot of them became fed up and left the church, sorry. That split was finally resolved by the end of that decade. And so then in the 2010s, you saw, again, a new movement towards forming a diocese. First step towards that was strengthening the council by forming a new council constitution that was actually approved by the Synod in India in 2014, 2015. That gave the council a lot more authority. I guess I would say before the churches were affiliated with the council, but it was a lot more loose. Now the council is trying to do more things with the different congregations, but it's still kind of a work in progress, right? Because anytime there's a new organization that's a little bit more centralized, the local leaders are a little suspicious, right? And they're like, what exactly is happening with this council? What are they doing? So it's an ongoing process. And then going into the 2020s, I think there are some questions that come alongside the strengthened council. So with the strengthened council, can we do ordination of uchins here? Can we form things like a Sunday school curriculum? Should we be forming a diocese? Should our vision be something else? The Synod sent us a letter asking us to not only organize Malayalam congregations, but also to try and bring in Tamil and Telugu and Kannada people and even help them form congregations. It's so hard for us. On the one side, I understand the hesitancy of some of our church's leaders in responding to that, because it's so hard for us to even organize within ourselves. But on the other hand, isn't that something that maybe we should be called to be doing? How do we do that? Those are all questions that kind of face us in this new decade. I'm going to end here with, I think, the need or the reason why it's important for us to recover the theological vision for the Church of South India. And part of the reason why I've gone on at length about this class, because I think it holds a lot of lessons for us and what we're trying to do. So Leslie Newbegin, at the end of his life, returned back to Britain. And he saw that the Britain that he had left in the 1930s was now a different place. It was now more of a post-Christian place. And he realized that in this new situation, converting people, evangelizing people was going to be necessary again, because you can't just assume that the West is Christian, and that the means to converting people would have to rely on the same kinds of dynamics that he saw working in India, which was a united congregation that really believed the gospel, and which, because it believed the gospel, united with one another across caste and class and ethnic lines and gender lines, and also had a love for serving the city in which it was a part, outside of instead of just seeing itself as existing for the benefit of its own members. So I'm just going to end the class by reading his statement here. This is Nubian. I have come to feel that the primary reality of which we have to take account in seeking for a Christian impact on public life is the Christian congregation. How is it possible that the gospel should be credible, that people should come to believe that the power which has the last word in human affairs is represented by a man hanging on a cross? I'm suggesting that the only answer, the only hermeneutic of the gospel, is a congregation of men and women who believe it and live by it. I am, of course, not denying the importance of the many activities by which we seek to challenge public life with the gospel: evangelistic campaigns, distribution of Bibles and Christian literature, conferences, and even books such as this one. But I am saying that these are all secondary, and that they have power to accomplish their purpose only as they are rooted in and lead back to a believing community. And so that's part of the reason why we're having this class, is because I want us to understand that everything that we're doing in encouraging one another and learning about these topics is to take it back to our believing communities. Part of the reason why we need to know our own histories and why I'm excited that so many of you joined this class is because I want you to be kind of evangelists for this history back at your own churches. Because I think part of the reason why our churches are so insular or introverted, looking only towards its own internal life, is because we don't even know who we are. And I think if we can share who we are, we will see that it is totally in keeping with our identity and with our mission to be about evangelism and about serving the broader community around us. So I'll stop with that. Do any of you guys have any questions before I close?
Hey Brian, this is Karen. I don't have a question per se, but I think I've just want to say that I've thoroughly enjoyed the classes that you've taken, and especially been looking forward to this one. And I think you asked us some really tough questions about whether we're willing to let the church die. So lots for us to kind of reflect upon, and I know I will certainly be trying to take it back to my youth and hopefully inspire others to the call of evangelism. So thank you very much. I know this took a lot of work, so I really appreciate it.
Thanks, Karen. I did get a question. The point about justice versus evangelism is interesting. I was under the impression that the church's approach to evangelism would take place through the acts of justice, addressing poverty, lack of healthcare, and then evangelizing to them. Yeah, I mean, that was basically the approach of the missionaries themselves. And I wouldn't say that it's not the approach of the church today. I wouldn't want to leave you the impression that there isn't evangelism happening today, but I do think there is within our church a split, not as hard as as has happened in the churches in the West, because the church itself hasn't actually split, but there is kind of a split. You have a split between those who are more enthusiastic about evangelism and about conversions, and sort of overt evangelism, actually through words saying Jesus Christ is Lord, repent, believe the gospel, actually saying Jesus Christ is the only way to God, making that kind of exclusive truth claim. I think there's a group of people within our church that is still very passionate about that, and they see the justice stuff as more secondary or as a means to end for that. And then there's others who think the justice stuff is primary and are kind of embarrassed by those people who make those exclusive truth claims about Jesus. Next class is actually going to be about the American churches, and and this has actually happened in the European churches too, but we'll be focusing on the churches in the United States and Canada more specifically, and you'll see how that tension kind of arose and why it led to splits within the church. And whereas it led to splits within the church in the United States and Canada, that didn't happen in the CSI. The church stayed together, but you see this difference in emphasis. And so I don't think there's the kind of united enthusiasm for direct evangelization like there was under the missionaries and in the early years of the church, like in the 1940s and 50s. I think there became a little bit more embarrassment about evangelism as time went forward amongst a certain set of people. And I think that has held us back And I also think it has held us back in terms of actually training the people. I think another problem that I didn't talk about as much in terms of like living out our mission and things like that is that there was a lot of consensus on theological questions at the elite level, like among the bishops and uchins who first formed the church and their successors. There's a lot of consensus on those questions, but I don't think that stuff was ever really properly taught to the masses of people. Most people didn't, like, they knew they were part of a new church, but they didn't really understand what that all meant. That was never really taught to them. And so I think another part of our mission in like keeping evangelism and justice united and together and not separating them is also showing them the theology of that, right? Like explaining the theology of that. And that's one of my ambitions for this class too. I had a question. Would you say that the move for justice is passive evangelism? Yeah, I would say that's right. I would say that probably the people who are very passionate about justice say that's enough. You don't actually have to say anything about Jesus. Whereas I think the older missionaries, like Newbegin himself, would be like, you need to have the words and the deeds together. You have to actually say Jesus is Lord, and you actually have to act in a way that shows that, which means if Jesus is Lord, it means serving people whether they are Christian or not, right? Like, so both of those have to go together. And another question, what is the current status of the CSI Church in its effort to keep uniting? Is that still an active mission? Maybe not looking as drastic of a unity as it did in the past, working in the background through our missions? I would say our church is still the leader in like pressing other churches for uniting. I would also say it takes two to tango, right? Like, it's not that our church is not willing to unite. It's that our potential partners are not willing to unite right as so far. So in the 1960s, there was this really serious attempt to unite with the Lutheran Church. And at the end of the day, the Lutherans, again, kind of like backed away from uniting. That would have been a big deal. There's also, in all kinds of ecumenical matters, our church is the one that kind of takes the forefront in convening people, bringing people together, and trying to do things together. But so far, that has not led anywhere. Again, it's kind of this thing where at the elite level, the bishops and the priests and the people who care about this stuff, they're still just as passionate about uniting with others. But I don't know if that's necessarily translated to the masses of people. It hasn't really been taught to them why that's important, what the cost of that would be, all those kinds of things. I don't think we've necessarily trained our people to really understand. But yes, the church is still having those conversations with people. It's actively in talks with the Methodist Church in India, which is, we united with the British Methodists, but the American Methodists started their own church. There's also an American Presbyterian Church that we have some conversations with. I think realistically, the bigger potential for union is between the Church of North India and the Church of South India. I know that the past moderator has talked about how that's a dream of his, that the churches would unite to form just one Church of India. That would be a big deal too, because South Indians do see themselves as culturally distinct from North Indians and vice versa. So we'll see if it happens, but if a new kind of union happened, I would expect it would happen with the Methodist Church in India or the CNI. That's probably what would happen in the near term future, if it did happen. Okay, any other questions? Do you feel that our congregation's members' desire to preserve our ethnic identities and cultures are hindering the larger CSI Church's desire to push for a greater unity amongst other denominations due to fear of driving away the masses? Yeah, I do think that is part of it. I do think this, at least from what I've seen, because I don't know the other dioceses as much, I do think this is also a distinctively Madhya Kerala problem because of the desire to still be accepted by our Syrian Christian brothers and sisters, right? Like if we start uniting even more, will we still have that same acceptance by them? You know, just as like an aside, I remember talking to a Syrian Christian person I know who was talking, an older person who grew up in India, and they talked about how, you know, there was a CSI church near their village in Kerala, but then he looked at me but he was like, but it wasn't the real Christians like you. It was those other kinds of like CSI Christian people. What he's talking about there is like caste, right? Like it's the Dalit, there was a Dalit untouchable caste CSI church near his village. And those weren't the real Christians, right? And so there probably is something like that that is affecting us, and maybe even if our parents won't say it that way, affecting them. And it probably does hinder us in uniting with other denominations. I don't know how you deal with that other than maybe like calling it out. And again, pointing to like our history and asking, like, what are we really? Are we, what legacy are we a part of? Are we part of the missionaries and what they were trying to do, or are we something else? Okay, I think that's it for now. If you guys have any other questions, feel free to text the group or to text me. And we will have our next meeting in February. I'll set out a day on there afterwards. I'm thinking around February 20th. Does that, if that does not work for you, let me know. But I'm thinking around February 20th, we will have our next meeting. Okay, talk to you guys later. Bye.
Thanks, Brian.
Thank you.